Okay, so thanks, Vajradevi, for coming along to. We just thought you could make a really valuable contribution to the focus we've recently had on well-being and mental health in the order related to people's practice and people talking about that. So thanks very much for being willing to contribute. Um, and we have some questions to ask you. Um, so I'll just put these to you, and you take them where you want, as it were,
Okay.
and we'll see how where that goes to. So the first thing was, because you're quite an experienced meditation teacher, um, and we wondered if do you, in your opinion, do you think meditation helps people to become aware of trauma, for example, that they're not aware of, and if it does it actually help them to overcome it and release it? Um, what do you
Yeah,
think?
yeah, okay. Um, I think it can. I think meditation can be a useful aid to help people. Well, I suppose in our mindfulness practice, we're becoming aware of what's happening, and with the meta influence, we're becoming aware, hopefully, in a kind of way, and that allows things to emerge more into consciousness. Um, so the more that we can sort of notice experience that's perhaps been quite buried and learn to be with it without identifying with it, with a spaciousness, with kindness, that's all very good. But I do think that there comes a certain point, for some people, I think, where you need something else. If you like, you need to sort of broaden your toolbox. Um, and actually, I think with things like trauma, then or mental health issues, sometimes you need a different framing for your experience. So you might need a more psychological or therapeutic sort of framing. You might need what's talked about as trauma education, a different perspective on the experience, maybe in relation to something like the nervous system. Um, so those are quite specific that you might need to bring in. Or I know that some people naturally have things like focusing as part of their meditative practice, and so then you're bringing in things that I think can be really helpful, to mental health or to trauma. Yeah, without just because they're naturally there, they're naturally something that you're doing that already is part of our sort of context in the movement. So I think it's both. I think it can be helpful, and at a certain point, we probably need other things as well, other help and other framing. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's helpful. Following on from that, really, because you were saying about adding to your toolkit. So, do you think that means that if you're teaching meditation, that really it's a good idea to have some training in maybe recognizing trauma, or how you might respond to that?
I think I wouldn't limit it to meditation teachers. Actually, I think it's just becoming much better known. I think the whole field of trauma, and particularly things, not so much the sort of severe or one-off or PTSD type trauma, but what's being talked about is relational trauma or developmental trauma that maybe comes, from something as simple as a hospitalization for you as a baby, where there's a separation, big separation between you and your primary caregivers. So I think there's actually, what I'm finding on retreats is that there are more people who are recognizing in themselves. They come on retreat and they're recognizing in themselves that some sort of trauma is an issue, and they are looking for help, or they really appreciate it if there is some um, understanding of what they're going through, of what the experience is. So yeah, I've looked into some training with David Treleaven, who is a Canadian who runs a program, trauma sensitive mindfulness program. And as far as I know, he's the only person I've come across who's actually a long term meditator, but also is a trauma professional. He has a lot of training behind him. I don't feel I want to invest in that level of training, but I've found what he's offered in terms of being able to recognize a bit more and to be helpful to some degree with people coming along. I found that really helpful, partly just to have a conversation where people coming along, in a way, there's some sort of connection. They don't feel like she doesn't have a clue what I'm talking about, or she's not interested in this area, just wants to talk about meditation. It's like that intersection between well, meditation and the whole sort of breadth of body mind experience, what's going on there. So I'm aware of other people, other meditation teachers in Triratna who have either trained in something or are also we're sort of training ourselves or getting ourselves some sort of trauma psychoeducation, I believe it's called, to be able to understand people coming along. But I know it's an issue that's been talked about by centre chairs, and hoping it will go further into various local centres. And I know that the women's ordination team, they've been in touch with me, and we've had some dialogue around it. So yeah, I think I don't know. I wouldn't sort of say, oh yes, every meditation teacher or Dharma teacher needs to take some training, but I think it will gradually become something, or even quite quickly become something, that we need to be a bit more trauma aware or trauma informed, aware of how so many of us are affected
Yeah.
by by things that happen to us.
Sure.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
could I just ask you then, if you were teaching meditation and you were aware that someone had either trauma or maybe a high degree of anxiety, would you tend to give them a specific approach to mindfulness, or even specific practices, or would it change how you taught meditation to them, basically, or even maybe suggest that meditation isn't helpful at that time?
Yeah, I think it would very much depend on some sort of dialogue with the person. Um, I mean, before finding out about David Treleaven and the trauma sensitive mindfulness, I trained to some degree with the mindfulness-based stress reduction program, and that um, has a secular mindfulness perspective, but that works particularly with people who are experiencing a lot of stress, anxiety, or depression. And the thing they say there is that you actually, meditation isn't helpful for someone who's actively experiencing depression. If their symptoms are reduced through medication, that's fine. But otherwise, you can just really, through meditation, you can actually end up focusing on the spiraling negative
Sure.
thoughts, the papancha, and that's really unhelpful. But at a certain point, yeah, that approach I found useful. It's quite body based. It emphasizes relaxation, and not believing the stories. Has this lovely little phrase: "Thoughts are not facts."
Yeah.
So I think it really helps. I think that's quite sort of common in Triratna now. We are
Yeah.
familiar with that phrase, but it points to a whole area of learning how not to identify with very unpleasant experiences going on in the body and the mind. Um,
mm,
yeah, so not we're both being with, and but being with in a way that we're not identified with what's happening. Um, and I think you get those sorts of approaches in traditional Buddhist meditation as well, because that's where the MBSR is drawn from. Um, yeah, and I think my own sort of approach, what I've learned through teachers, particularly teachers in Burma, um, is quite compatible with the principles that you would use for maybe someone, yeah, you can see struggling, or the anxiety, something like that. So I think one thing I've become more aware of is of how certain things that we can ask people to focus on in meditation can be themselves a source of triggering. So we might ask them to focus on the breath, or we commonly do, and that can be something that there's a trigger with. Maybe they've held their breath in relation to certain sort of traumas in the past,
yeah,
or the body. Sometimes the body is a source of triggering. So giving people a choice, something I've learned that's really important. So you wouldn't insist on a particular object, but say if that, if that doesn't work for you, then feel free to maybe use the hands, use sounds around.
yeah,
You can be aware of anything. You can use anything as an object in which to grow mindfulness, or to grow some degree of samadhi. So that flexibility, I think, is really helpful for people. You offer options. Um, yeah, what else? Yes, one other thing to say is that, and David Treleaven makes this distinction quite clearly. The distinction between, if you like, someone like me who's done an online training with him, um, and someone like him who's spent years and years, who really knows the whole sort of neuroscientific background. They're very, very skilled. So he makes a distinction between maybe what we're doing as meditation teachers or in public centers is recognizing when someone needs more than we can offer.
yeah,
Um, when we can offer them choice, we can offer them maybe body-based practices. We can say, just sit for as long as you like. If you need to get up after 10 minutes and go in the other room and sit quiet, all these ways in which we can give people choice. He said if that is still, they still find that they're getting overwhelmed by the anxiety, then
yeah,
um, maybe that's the time to have a conversation about some sort of more professional specific approach, psychotherapy or somatic experiencing, something like that.
sure.
Yeah,
Just sort of knowing your limits in a way, what you can,
exactly,
how much help
exactly.
you can offer.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, well, an interesting thing that we've been finding, the Abhiratna Trust, we give grants to order members. It used to be, historically, it used to be mainly for retreats, but that's changed a lot. And in recent years, we've been finding we've been giving a lot more grants to order members for therapy of different sorts. People with anxiety and different mental health difficulties, um, and I suppose a question that comes up is, do do you think that's to be expected with people who practice a lot, that things will surface that then need to be dealt with, or could it be a sign of a lack in the way that we practice? How would you view that?
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Um, I think I could certainly recognize. I think if maybe it's a combination of the two almost. If we don't quite recognize that we need certain tools, the habits maybe sort of get stronger over time. Um, I think, yeah, from my own experience, certain sort of habits or patterns, um, I felt like they hadn't really been touched that much through practice,
mm,
and it's then easy to feel that, where do you go? What do you do with that? It feels like something is getting stronger, and maybe it is because perhaps there's more separation between what sometimes people talk about, the leading edge and the trailing edge.
yeah,
So maybe you can feel it on the whole. I feel integrated. I feel kind. You know, there's a certain degree of wisdom, and then there are these habits that sort of
mm,
trail a bit behind. And I wonder if that becomes a bit clearer as practice goes on. The more we practice, in a way, maybe in the beginning we're a bit more we're a bit more sort of amorphous, but when we really develop ourselves,
yeah,
perhaps then yeah, we're more aware of those bits that are a bit left behind and perhaps do need a different sort of approach. Um, I think one of the things can be we think, oh, perhaps I need more self-compassion. I need that, and I was thinking about that and thinking, well, it's hard to have compassion or self-compassion when you don't really understand why practice feels like it's not working.
mm,
You know, you feel like you're doing the best that you can, and it can be hard not to get into some sort of self-blame around that, um, especially as the patterns get more visible as we get older and we practice for longer. So I think having a different perspective that I was talking about at the beginning, that trauma psychoeducation, or the perspective of the nervous system, I think that perspective can be very freeing, um, because sometimes what you experience is mainly in the body. And I think that sense of understanding why that's happening can be very, very helpful to self-compassion, actually, a sense of not blaming. Um,
yeah,
I came across a little quote just yesterday, actually, or the day before, and the quote is, "It's not about what's wrong with you, which is where we can go with it, but what happened to you." And that what happened to you is not about blame, but it's about realizing that, for whatever reason, certain things happened, and how do we respond to them now? How do we understand what's happening and respond to it now?
yeah,
How do we heal things that perhaps that were not anybody's fault necessarily, but the body mind system needs something else. Um, and I think that can be integrated into practice to quite a degree. Um,
mm,
I found one of the things that David Treleaven, he has these guest slots in the course, so he brings in different people, and one of the people he brought in was Rick Hanson, I think he's a psychologist, possibly a neuroscientist as well, and a long time meditator, I think in the Tibetan tradition. And he has a lot of what he calls resourcing exercises, and really they're mainly mini metta
mm,
uh, practices, but they involve quite a lot of metaphor. They involve saying, this is how the brain is affected through doing this particular um, exercise for 10 or 20 seconds a few times a day. You know, there's a certain sort of perspective. It's like, oh, this is how I grow resources for the mind. So I think maybe a contribution by understanding the brain and the nervous system more is ways that we can, if you like, use meta sort of in a more targeted way or a more specific sort of way that then feeds out more into our overall meta practice. Um,
yeah. I think what I'm also taken from that is that we need to be quite adaptable. You know, not have a fixed approach in a way, because you know that we need to be responding to whatever's particularly needed that arises, uh, which I suppose in some ways is quite obvious, but I suppose we even get into habits in the way that we practice, don't
Yeah, yeah. Maybe we have certain views about what that maybe it should all be able to happen from
we? Hmm.
our meditation practice or just what we've been given through Ratna. But I think yeah, I think there is personally I think there's a need for that flexibility and openness and honesty about what's really happening and how long has it been going on for and you know a real sort of open investigation, which at its best, I think meditation, we can do that through meditation, we can do it through
Yeah,
certain types of practice. I think particularly the more just sitting pure awareness
yeah.
type of practice.
I suppose that also means building up a context and the trust to be able to be, well, the awareness to know what is going on in your experience, and then also the trust to be able to share that with other people. So I guess that would take time to emerge, really, wouldn't it?
I think it does. It does because I think that you start off just with in a way trusting your own experience and often it's a practice of just seeing greed, hatred, and delusion in action. You know, if you're looking at the sort of less integrated bits or that trailing edge, and being able to really be with those things with some degree of understanding, some degree of acceptance or kindness, and a lack of judgment, and saying this is not the end of the story, but this is what's happening
Mm,
right now. Yeah, yeah.
great.
Which is a lot what I teach actually. It's a lot the approach that I take yeah in my teaching in my book.
Yeah, that's great. Well, talking about your book, we thought you might like to say something about your book. You have
Well,
the,
I happen as well.
yeah, which is
Yeah.
it's a really helpful book because it's full of little practices. It's one of these books that and also you really share your personal experience and insights into things. So it's certainly a useful book, I think. But
It's,
we
it's,
thought you might want to say a bit more about that. We could finish up with that if you like.
yeah, yeah. So an approach that's drawn from the Satipatthana Sutta. So it's really where mindfulness and insight practice come together, or mindfulness as a wisdom practice. Um, but it's very receptive, and I think that's maybe the sort of connection point with what we've been talking about today is that you're really receptive to what's happening uh, in your experience and at the same time looking to understand the nature of that experience. Um, and that doesn't just happen on the cushion, which is why I've got so many personal examples and why often they don't happen on the cushion, that they happen when I'm cycling or when I'm swimming or when I'm, working. But I think, yeah, the approach, because it's quite receptive, is to some extent um, trauma sensitive because it offers that flexibility, it offers the choice about where you put your attention or where the attention goes. You're more noticing where the attention goes rather than trying to direct attention, which is important to have an element of that in practice. I'm not saying it's the only thing, but it's important to have an element. But it also encourages this curiosity about experience, about the nature of mind, nature of experience.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a great
yeah, but sorry.
uncontrolled mindfulness. I think it's a great title. Really.
Yeah, yeah, that was there's a bit of a story behind that, but probably don't have time for it.
No,
But
probably not.
yeah, but just to say, it's available through Windhorse, the book on Contrived Mindfulness. Uh, yeah, and it's also available on my blog site. Actually, you can access Windhorse through my blog site on contrivedmindfulness.net.
Great.
Mm.
Okay, yeah, sounds like a good book to get to me. Um, yeah, thanks very much. That I think that's really helpful. It kind of addresses a lot of things that seem to be uh, becoming prevalent. Actually, well, like I say, we are finding we're giving more grants to order members for therapy and anxiety issues, and so I think this would be really helpful
Mm.
for people. And yeah, we'll be sending it out in our newsletter,
Mm.
putting it on our
Well, it's
website.
great you're doing this. It's great you're doing the series. I've really enjoyed
Yeah,
reading and listening to the previous ones through the
oh,
year.
great, good.
Mm.
Okay, thank you. Um, I'm going to switch off the recording now.
Yeah.